Hello.
I went digging deep into Gale's head to discover the secrets that motivate him. And while I was in there, I also found a bunch of hidden dialogue, ranging from uncommon to unobtainable to unfinished. There will be some numbers and code to keep track of.
But don't be alarmed. I'm here with you.
Under the hood, much of Gale's dialogue and decisions are determined by a point system called goal score. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue like Night Song points, but that's what it's called. It's actually split into two different scores, one for Gale's resolve to detonate the orb, and another for his desire to claim the crown of Karsus. There are important flags set at three different score thresholds: 1, 3, and 6. When you first recruit Gale, his death score starts at 0. However, his crown score starts at 3, when at this point he doesn't even know the crown exists and he ain't been swayed towards nothing. Each of these two scores can be pushed up or down by making various conversation choices throughout the game. When you push away from a goal, that score is decreased by 1. But when you push toward, not only is that goal score increased by 1, but the opposing goal score is decreased by 1. And yes, these scores can go into negative numbers. The flags are cumulative, so if you gain the flag for a higher score tier, you will still pass any checks for the flags below that. But if the score later drops below a tier, that flag will be cleared. It's impossible to have opposing score flags set at the same time any higher than willing, since pushing one up will always push the other one down. Now that you know how this system works, it's time to show each opportunity you have to actually change the score and what impact those changes have on Gale's fate. Every chance to directly push the death score takes place in Act 2, so let's cover those first. After the meeting with Elminster where he disarms the orb, Gale will pop up a conversation with your first chance to affect the death score. As long as you don't completely blow him off, then every other dialogue option will end up at this choice. Option 1 will push toward death, and Option 2 will push away from death. Get used to watching for those score icons, because I won't be calling out every individual option in each conversation. The video is already long enough as it is. The next chance happens during the conversation that pops up after you let Gale destroy the ritual circle inside Balthazar's hidden room in Moonrise Towers. You only get one chance to push away and no push toward options, so don't worry if you miss this one. If you create the Shadow Lantern instead of destroying the circle, you get a different conversation with no score changes. And that's the last of the simple conversations. It all gets more complex from here. Speaking of Moonrise, it's stepping inside the tower that sets the flag for a very important nighttime camp scene with Gale. As usual, if you have other camp scenes piled up, you may have to long rest a few times to get them out of the way. And of course, you also need to speak with Elminster before this scene will be available, but if you haven't done that by the time you get to Moonrise Towers, he'll show up in your camp after a long rest anyway. When all that's cleared up, the next night you'll see Gale's mirror image inviting you to spend some time with him. During the conversation, none of the first options make any changes until this choice. Even though this line sounds like you're talking him out of the idea of blowing himself up, picking it will actually push him toward death. At the next set of options, one choice will push away from death and one will push toward death. However, that push toward choice will not appear if you already chose the previous push toward death line that I mentioned. It does mean that you can push toward death and then immediately push away from death to cancel it out. But remember that any increase in the death score will also cause a decrease in the crown score, and that can have a very significant impact on Gale's future, but we'll get to that later. If you're already dating Gale, this scene is also your opportunity to begin a full romance with him. But either way, none of the remaining dialogue options have any effect on his goal score. And that's the last of the chances to push his death score up. If you've been keeping track, you may have noticed that you can't push it any higher than 2, making Willing to Die the highest tier you can reach. And setting that flag doesn't really change much. You never need to make a skill check to talk him out of blowing up. In the colony, the goal score flags aren't even checked. Being at Tier 1 death score just makes a handful of small changes to dialogue lines. And when I say small, I really mean it. Here's an example. If Gale was in the party when you first saw the Elder Brain in the colony, upon returning to Moonrise, he'll want to speak to you. The opening line of this conversation is always the same, but the way he says the line will change depending on his death score. Listen carefully. First, with a death score of 0.
I can't help but feel like I've been fumbling in the dark for too long, and I've just had a lit torch thrust into my hands.
And now with a death score of 1.
I can't help but feel like I've been fumbling in the dark for too long, and I've just had a lit torch thrust into my hands.
So, what about those 2 higher death score tiers? Is there any dialogue locked behind those flags? Yes, there is. You just can't reach it during normal play. But since when do I let that stop me? You want to see it? There are 3 lines requiring the Ready to Die flag. The first can only be seen after Elminster has disarmed the orb. Then you need to kill Gale while he's not in the party and cast Speak with Dead on him, and ask this question.
Ending the absolute with a bang.
The second line is in the dialogue that shows up after speaking to Elminster in Act 3. The response to this question has multiple variations. If his death score is 1 or 2, he'll say this.
I regret many things in my life. Choosing to be here, intact and unexploded, is not one of them. Though the orb still seems to offer our best hope of destroying the brain, I retain some hope that another, less costly solution can be found. For now, to have a few more days in your company, no. I wouldn't change a thing.
But if his death score is 3, he'll say this instead.
The orb's power is undiminished. If we do not succeed, I will not hesitate when the time comes.
The third hidden line is only available if you are romancing Gale. In Act 3, before the boat scene, more on that later, if you ask him how he's feeling, you'll see no, that's the wrong line. There's a higher priority line in this dialogue that triggers if his crown score is below 1. And since his death score starts at 0, pushing it up 3 times will push the crown score down to 0. Okay, then I'll just change the goal score database directly to force a score that flips both flags to true at the same time. Nope, that won't work either, because there's another line that will trigger if his crown score is above 0. Fine, I'll modify the actual dialogue file to bypass those crown score flag checks. The things I do to show you one line of dialogue.
Like I missed a golden opportunity. And now I'm going to pay a far higher price for the same prize. When the time comes for the orb to fulfill its purpose, I will think of only one thing. Your face. Nothing else will matter.
And that brings us to Death Score 6, Eager to Die. There's only one line of dialogue that requires this flag, and it only shows up if you're romancing Gale. After meeting Tara on the roof in Act 3, Gale will pop up an extra conversation if you're in a romance with him. This same conversation also has another bit of dialogue hidden behind a bugged flag check, so I'll show that too. This question about Gale's last name is not available in Patch 6, though Larian has announced that it's fixed in Patch 7. So if you're watching this in the future when this or any other bugs I show have been fixed, I'm sorry for wasting your time.
It is. Courtesy of my mother, the inimitable, dare I say it, sometimes unavoidable Morena Dekarius. It's been so long since I've used it. Gale Dekarius cuts a poor figure next to the wizarding prowess of Gale of Waterdeep.
You like so many things about me I'd have sooner discarded. Your generosity is quite wonderful. Gale Dekarius likes you too. Very, very much. Though let's keep his existence between ourselves for now. I'd actually been thinking about introducing the two of you anyway, over a sumptuous home-cooked meal, if that sounds at all to your taste. My tower in Waterdeep boasts an excellent kitchen and a wine cellar to rival Ondal himself. Not to mention a larder stocked with my homemade Hundor sauce.
That's how it plays out if Gale's death score is 0. If it's at 6, he says this instead.
I always imagined what it would be like when you finally got to meet her. This wasn't quite what I pictured. I thought we'd be in Waterdeep. You, curled up before a roaring hearth while I prepared us a ridiculously extravagant meal, served with a batch of my homemade Hundor sauce. Gods, I love your optimism. Contagious in the most endearing way. I fear mine is a dream for another life, but a fine one nonetheless. As for this one, I think we've still got a world to save. Unless there's anything else.
With Gale's death score all wrapped up, it's time to move on to the crown score. You start at 3, and that swayed to crown flag is by far the most important one out of the whole lot, so I'll go into more detail on it later. There are only 2 lines of dialogue that require a crown score of 6, both of which are only accessible if you are romancing Gale. It is possible to hit that threshold, but doing it in time to actually see those 2 lines requires you to make very specific choices, so let's cover all of the options. All chances to directly push the crown score happen in Act 3, starting when you find the Annals of Karsus inside the vault in Sorcerous Sundries. If you don't know how to get here, well, there are already a lot of videos about that. Allowing Gale to read this book is very important. If you skip coming here, or convince him not to read it, you are dooming him to die, unless you already lowered his crown score in Act 2 by pushing him toward death. Which I suppose is kind of ironic. Why is he doomed? I'll explain more once we get to the epilogues. The conversation that occurs while Gale reads the book plays out quite differently if you're in a romance with him. If you're not, then you will have several different choices available that adjust his crown score. None of the initial options change anything until you finally reach this 5th set of choices. Either of the top 2 options will push him away from the crown. None of the other choices in this list change his score, though this specific line will open up a new choice in the next set of options that will also push the crown score down while still allowing you to choose another option from the same list. There are a couple unique options for wizards or Shadowheart, though the result of picking them is the same as the generic push toward crown option. But this option, that can only be chosen by a cleric of Mystra, gives an extra chance to push the crown score down by leading to one final choice, just as the generic line does. At this last option, every choice except the bottom one will push Gale away from the crown. If you are in a romance with Gale, this whole conversation will be much shorter, with no option to push him toward the crown and only one option to push him away. Don't worry, you'll get plenty of chances to change his mind once you hop in his boat later. If you've used all the chances at your disposal, this is the first point at which you could have driven Gale's crown score all the way down to 0. But there's only one significant change that comes from that, and it's during the scene when you first meet Loroakan. There are 3 different variations of this interaction, all of which require that you've already learned about the crown. The dialogue where Gale's crown score is 1 or higher is the version most commonly seen, so I won't bother showing it here. However, if you already read the Annals of Karsus and pushed the crown score down to 0, Loroakan will trash talk Gale something fierce.
Perhaps it was indeed wise to dissuade me from the crown of Karsus. A jumped-up wizard drunk on promises of power is not an enviable company.
What's that? I didn't quite catch the words, but your tone was clear enough.
Nothing at all, friend. I was merely admiring your ambition.
Ah, I believe I recognize you. Gale of Waterdeep, Mister's discarded lapdog, reduced to trailing after some adventurer. How you have fallen. Do you still pine for her? Run around, trying to impress her in the hope she'll take you back.
I'm my own man.
Make my own choices.
You keep telling yourself that.
The third version is much shorter and requires you to have pushed the crown score down to 0 without reading the Annals of Karsus, which isn't possible. But I took care of that.
Let him chase his prize if he wishes. We know of an even greater one that he is blind to. The crown.
What's that? I didn't quite catch the words, but your tone was clear enough.
Oh, nothing, friend. Just a little trapped wind. Sure you understand.
The only other lines that change with a low crown score require a romance with Gale. I showed one earlier when asking him how he feels, though it will only show up if you haven't taken his romantic boat ride yet. Speaking of, after reading the Annals of Karsus, anyone romancing Gale has an important decision to make. Once you've spoken with Elminster outside the store or in camp, the next time you end the day, Gale will have that romantic cruise waiting for you. But this scene has many variations, based not only on Gale's current goal score, but also how the meeting with Mystra went. This includes triggering the scene before you even talk to Mystra, which can lead to a few unique lines at the start of the conversation. For example, if you pushed him toward death at both chances and pushed him away from the crown using your one chance with the book, he'll start the conversation like this.
I owe you an apology. Things became quite heated between us before, after I learned of the crown of Karsus. I allowed myself to get carried away, and failed to properly explain myself.
Though even in that situation, he will still try to talk you into becoming a god with him during the scene. You probably want to wait until after meeting Mystra to trigger this conversation, since it opens up the chance for some extra dialogue and even an entirely different version of the scene depending on the choices you make at the tabernacle. So let's move on to that, and I'll cover the Be My God scene in more detail afterward. Once you click on Mystra's statue, none of the conversation options matter until you reach this third set. Not only can you directly push Gale toward or away from the crown here, but his current goal score before you make a choice will also come into play. Convincing Gale not to talk to Mystra at all has the same end result as simply ignoring this quest altogether, so don't bother unless you just like to make him uncomfortable. The simplest route is to pick this neutral option, which will not change his score at all and will lead to Gale addressing Mystra in a neutral way. If your crown score is below 3 when picking this option, or at 3 or above when picking this option, Gale will be confused by your shifting attitude and will also approach Mystra in a neutral fashion. Now, if Gale's crown score is 3 or higher when you tell him to make Mystra squirm, he will gladly do so, taking an aggressive stance when talking with her. If his crown score is below 3 and you tell him to ask for forgiveness, he will agree that it's the right thing to do and meekly apologize to Mystra, promising to bring her the crown. Doing this also sets Gale's path when it comes to the epilogue. He will always give the crown to Mystra and remain a normal human, unless you convince him to explode, of course. But I'll cover how the epilogue works before too much longer. Hang in there. After returning from his chat with Mystra, Gale will pop up a new conversation for you. If his crown score is currently below 3, he will be open to the idea of relinquishing the crown to Mystra. If his crown score is exactly at 2, this is your last chance to push it up to 3 if you want him to embrace ambition and become a god. Just pick this option, and then this choice to encourage him, with the other available lines all pushing him further away from the crown. If Gale's crown score is at 3 or higher after his confrontation with Mystra, his attitude when talking with you will be very different, enthusiastic to reforge the crown and become a god. If you've decided you don't want him to do that, you're not romancing him, and his crown score is exactly 3, this is your last chance to talk him out of his ambition and keep him human in the epilogue. If you want to do this, pick this option, then any of these 3 choices, then finally this specific line to push his crown score down by 1. If that score was already 4 or higher at this point, then doing this will ultimately change nothing. On the other hand, if you want to encourage him to become a god, there are many dialogue options that will do just that. In fact, with a very specific path of choices, you can actually push him toward the crown twice. To do this, avoid the obvious lines of encouragement and start with this choice. Then select this option for the first push toward, followed by this choice for the second. If you are romancing Gale and already pushed his score up to 4 before he met with Mystra, this route is the only way to hit the maximum crown score in time to see the 2 extra lines of dialogue locked behind the Eager for Crown flag. The first of those lines is yet another that shows up if you ask Gale how he's feeling, but only if you ask him before the romantic boat scene.
Wonderful. At last, I can see a path ahead that doesn't end with me needing to turn this city into a desolate wasteland. I'm not sure I'll be brave enough for such a dream without you by my side, so thank you for believing in me.
And while we're back on the subject of that boat, let's see how meeting with Mystra first affects the outcome. If you have no interest in Gale's intimate side, then please feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter. If Gale has already met Mystra, this conversation will start with one of 3 different lines. If you've kept his crown score at 3 while also remaining neutral when he faced Mystra, Gale will be a bit confused by your lack of commitment and actually give you an extra chance to push toward or away from the crown before moving on to the usual scene. In addition to many different ways to adjust his crown score, this conversation also has several opportunities to set another flag that is very important for Gale romancers. If you want to maintain your relationship with Gale after he claims the crown, you will need this flag to be set. You can change your mind later, but this is your only chance to set it. This conversation is also where you can see the other line that requires a crown score of 6.
Yes, you have. But I want more than your support. I want your heart.
If you want to encourage Gale's godhood as much as possible, the simplest route is to just pick this option to accept his offer to become a god with him, and then give him a kiss to push him toward the crown. Keep in mind, since you can only increase his crown score by 1 here, if that score is below 2 by the time you're in the boat, he will still give up on the idea of claiming the crown once you reach the end of the game, no matter how enthusiastic he sounds about it right now. If you didn't already convince him to give the crown to Mystra before the meeting with her, you can still use this chance to push him away from the crown once or even twice, if you pick the correct, slightly strange route. Start with the same choice I mentioned before, but then immediately change your mind and pick this option to lower his score by 1, followed by this choice, and then this one to push the crown score down again, as well as reject his god proposal. Yes, this combination of choices will actually set you as accepting and rejecting the idea of becoming a god, since they are separate flags that do not cancel each other out. The reject flag is rarely checked, so Gale will still act excited about the 2 of you becoming gods, but then ditch the crown in the end. Now, if you successfully convinced Gale to seek Mystra's forgiveness before he met with her, the boat scene will play out very differently, with no offer to become a god and no chances to change his goal score at all. As mentioned earlier, he will always reject the idea of becoming a god if you send him down this path. The next time Gale's crown score comes into play is after the Emperor presents the option of becoming a Mind Flayer to fight the Elder Brain. If you show interest in being the one to transform, after a companion interjects, you will break out of the conversation, leading to a chance to discuss the situation with the party. If Gale's crown score is below 3 at this point, he will pop up a conversation where he offers to use the orb to sacrifice himself to destroy the brain. You can encourage or discourage him here, but nothing you say will actually affect your chances of talking him into or out of the idea once you reach the brain. If his crown score is 3 or higher, he will not have an exclamation point, but you can still choose to talk to him and make your own suggestion that he use the orb, which he won't be too happy about. If you've reached this point without lowering his crown score, but have decided you really want him to blow himself up, now is the time to convince him. You have a DC 25 Persuasion or Intimidation option to choose from here, but only a DC 30 Persuasion option later. If you don't actually want him to sacrifice himself, then there's no reason to go down this route, since it won't directly affect his desire for the crown. While we're here, it seems that at some point it was planned for Gale to also volunteer to become a Mind Flayer. The dialogue is still in the files, but in a rough draft state with no voice acting and no spell checking. There's no way to trigger it through setting flags, but with a little extra trickery, I can cause it to play. And this conversation actually has a 3rd line of dialogue that requires a crown score of 6. I'm curious if content that is this far outside normal gameplay is something people want to see more of, so if you do, or if you don't, please let me know in the comments. Once you reach the brainstem, if Gale's crown score is below 3 and you talk to him about the orb in the astral prism, he will want to blow himself up no matter what you've said to him before this point. But you can always talk him out of it without any skill check. If his crown score is 3 or higher, this option presents you with a DC 30 persuasion check that is your last chance to turn him away from the crown, right? Nope, it's bugged. Trying to set his goal score flags directly like this doesn't actually work. Any change will be immediately overwritten when his score is next calculated, so even if you succeeded the check, Gale only waits a fraction of a second before he goes right back to gunning for that crown. If Gale's crown score is below 3, his death score is below 1, and you never talk to him about the orb in the astral prism, there is actually a third version of this conversation. It's a rather elaborate chat with how many options you have, but no choices actually matter unless you pass the DC 25 persuasion to talk him into blowing up. And we're finally ready to talk about the different endings, which all split off at the same point, on the dock after defeating the Netherbrain. If Gale's crown score is below 3, he will always give up the crown, usually by taking it to Mystra. Though he will actually leave it in the river if you never even read the Annals of Karsus, or if he didn't already promise to take it to Mystra and you talk him into it. If you're not romancing Gale, the difference between the two outcomes is minimal, though Raphael will be pleased if you leave it in the water. Gale will return to Waterdeep and show up at the party as a still human professor. If you are in a romance with Gale, you'll have an extra scene where you wake up together. The opening of this conversation actually does play out a little differently if Gale gave the crown directly to Mystra or left it in the river. But the bigger difference actually comes down to your decision here. Staying in Baldur's Gate to rebuild will change a number of lines both during the morning scene and the epilogue. Choosing between returning to Waterdeep or going on adventures also changes a few lines, much more than your decision to marry him, oddly enough.
It hurts.
Of course, if you're playing as Karlach, your only choice of where to go for your honeymoon is Avernus.
I've heard Avernus is quite lovely this time of year.
You know, Gale, it really is, but I'll show more of that in a future video. If Gale's crown score is 3 or higher, and he met with Mystra, he will always claim the crown and successfully become a god in the epilogue. You can tell that you got this outcome if Gale's chest glows purple when he mentions the Karsite weave. If you are in a relationship with him, the only way to maintain that romance in the epilogue is to have accepted his proposal to become a god while on the boat, and to choose this option. Any other choice you make will end the relationship, but do not choose this specific line or you'll trigger a bug that I'll explain in a bit. Once you reach the epilogue, if you didn't accept his proposal to become a god, he will break off the romance with you. If you did accept the proposal on the boat, unless you intentionally turn him down here, you will have the chance to ascend to the heavens with him after the party. Now, if Gale reaches the dock with a crown score of 3 or higher, but didn't ever meet Mystra and learn about the Karsite weave, he will still always claim the crown no matter how much you might try to talk him out of it. This will lead to him exploding and showing up at the party as a spectral voice. This same outcome will happen if he blew himself up on purpose to destroy the brain, though a few lines will change. In either case, he will hand you a letter before he disappears. You probably won't get the letter you're supposed to receive because most of them are bugged. But before I get into those, we've got more important bugs to cover, so I hope you're ready to see some code. Normally, anytime Gale has a crown score of 3 or higher, he will claim the crown and try to become a god, setting both of these flags. Remember that one dialogue line I told you not to pick? That specific choice sets the flag for claiming the crown, but is missing the flag that indicates that Gale tried to become a god. Okay, what does that mean? If he didn't meet with Mystra to learn about the Karsite weave, it doesn't mean anything. If he has either flag set without the Karsite weave flag, he'll always show up as the spectral voice. If he does know about the Karsite weave, the code to turn him into a god only checks for the tri-god flag, not the claimed crown flag. Whoops. So what happens? There's actually a fallback meant to catch situations like this. As long as he just has a crown score of 3 and knows about the Karsite weave, all the proper flags are set and he becomes a god. Right? Well, the problem is that to trigger this fallback, the script has to pass a long list of missing flags, and one of those is the claimed crown flag, which is set to true. But wait, there's a fallback for the fallback that is triggered if all the other fallbacks fail. It wouldn't correctly make him a god, but would at least set him to a default state of human Gale who returned to Waterdeep. But the problem is, this fallback also checks for the claimed crown flag to be false, so it's also skipped. And I'd like to apologize for saying fallback 7 times in this paragraph. So he's not dead, he's not a god, and he's not a normal human professor. He'll still show up at the party as a human, but every dialogue line he's supposed to say requires a flag that he doesn't have set, leaving him with nothing but this one generic line.
Marvelous party, isn't it?
If you didn't like that bugged ending, don't worry, because there's an even better one. If you were still in a romance with Gale when he successfully became a god, the relationship is technically considered ended during the epilogue. This is why you have to pick that one particular option on the dock to maintain the romance. When the party ends, to determine if Gale will take you to the heavens, the game doesn't check the flag indicating that he is a god, but rather the flag that is set when the romance ended because he became a god. Okay, what difference does that make? When you choose to go to Avernus with Karlach, any romance with someone other than her, or Will if he went too, is ended. If that romance was with Gale, the same flag is set as when he becomes a god. Do you see where this is going? If you accepted his proposal to become a god while on the boat, but then pushed his crown score below 3, he'll give up the crown once you reach the dock, remaining human during the epilogue. If you're still partnered with him but go to Avernus with Karlach, Gale will speak to you as an ex-lover and ask you if you plan to come back to Faerun for him. Regardless of what you tell him, once the party ends, human Gale will take you up to the heavens with him. He never even needed that stupid crown. Before we finish, let's cover those bugged letters that I mentioned. There are a total of 7 different letters, meant to cover many different scenarios. But the code that determines which one you'll receive is a mess. If your approval with Gale is over 30 and he volunteered to blow himself up to destroy the brain, this is the letter you'll see. There is a separate version for the same scenario if you were in a romance with Gale, but the flag it checks for is the same one that is set when your romance ended because Gale became a god. So you can actually see this letter if you go to hell with Karlach before Gale blows himself up. This letter is intended to show up if your approval is above 30 and you persuaded Gale to detonate the orb when he didn't want to. But the flag it checks for doesn't exist. So anytime you talk him into blowing up, even with high approval, you'll get this letter. This same one will also show up as intended anytime your approval with Gale is below 30. If you accepted Gale's proposal in the boat and on the dock, but Gale failed to become a god, you'll receive this letter. This one is supposed to appear if you accepted the original god proposal but then broke things off on the dock. But once again, it checks for the flag that's set when Gale becomes a god while in a romance, so you can only trigger this letter in-game by accepting his god proposal during the boat ride, then going to hell with Karlach. If you have over 30 approval, this letter will show up in any other scenario where Gale tried to become a god and failed, even if you were in a romance with him. One final little bug. Regardless of how he exploded, there is an option to try to kiss the Spectral version of Gale. But you may not have seen it even if you were romancing him before he died. Why? Because the game looks for one of 2 specific flags before presenting the choice. Either that you accepted the proposal to become a god, or the same flag I keep mentioning that is set when romance Gale becomes a god. So, if you want to make sure this option is available, you know what to do.
Go to hell.
Aw, look how sad Shadowheart is. If you want to make her feel better, you can click this video that's all about her. Thank you very much for watching.